11, he says words of flattery, as well as truth, no doubt. Chapter 12, verse 11, he said unto Sarah, his wife, I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Now, the word fair means beautiful. Imagine retaining her beauty at 65, so that Abraham was afraid that some other man would look at her. Pretty good, I say. And when you flip over a little further down, you notice how the Egyptians felt about her. You go down a few more verses, and you notice that in verse 14 it says, when the Egyptians beheld Abram's wife, they said she was very fair, very beautiful. Color those words in green. See, Abraham wasn't just thinking this, it was so. Now, I think this is kind of important because remember how she was rejuvenated when she was a woman well along in years so she could have a child. And the sad part about this story is, if Abraham and Sarah had been in God's will, they would never have had to compromise. But Abraham said to his wife, you are a beautiful woman, and you know what those Egyptians are like. If they see a beautiful woman, they will take you, and they will take you to the Pharaoh, and you'll join his concubine, and I'll lose you. Now, I want to save my own neck. That's Abraham talking. So I want you to tell the Egyptians that you're my sister. All right, now that was a half-truth. She was a half-sister of Abraham by the same mother, not the same father. And so it was a half-truth. But God doesn't like half-truths. There should be no gray areas in our lives. They should be black or white. They should all be white. There shouldn't be any black either. But anyway, he says in verse 13, you might want to color this in, verse 13 of chapter 12, I beg you, say that you are my sister. Now, Abraham is the one there. See, this is the compromise, half-truth. He says, you are my sister. Say it for my sake. All right, now, what should a woman do when she's asked to compromise her testimony? Now, God, remember, had called Abraham and Sarah out of Ur of the Chaldees to a strange land. And he said he would provide for them. He had a home for them there. They went down to the land of Egypt. That was the beginning of getting out of fellowship with God. But when you begin to get out of fellowship with God, then other things usually creep in too, so you get further and further away from God. That's the tragedy of backsliding. And now he's asking his wife to compromise and to tell a half-truth. Now, I'm not going to say at this point what I think you ought to do if your husband asks you to compromise in some way concerning your testimony. I want you to think it through. It's not up to me to decide for you. I'm not responsible for the decisions you make. You are responsible before the Lord when testings like this come along your way. But there's one thing when you get home you can do that I think you might find very helpful. Throughout these scriptures on the life of Sarah, over and over again, she is only called by one title, Abram's wife. And you will find 17 times, we don't have time to do it in class, but 17 times in these portions that we're looking at this morning, these 5 times that we refer to Sarah, she is called Abram's wife. She is never recognized by God as a half-sister or anything else. It's always Abram's wife. All right, now, they get down there in the land of Egypt. They fail miserably because they're already out of God's will. And because they're out of God's will, one thing after another takes place. But you know, the thing about God is he's very patient with us. Aren't you glad? And he sees the predicament they have gotten themselves into. I don't imagine that Abraham was very happy when he was down there, nor was Sarah. Because they had always been one. They had gotten along very well. They were very compatible. Now they were separated because just as they predicted, she was taken and put into the harem. And what they usually did was for 6 to 9 months they would purify the woman so that she would be, all right for this king who already had several other concubines anyway. And so they were separated. And they both had a lot of time alone to think over what they had done. And I imagine they both had sincere regrets for what they did to each other. Perhaps Sarah was very uncomfortable thinking, I need the security of my husband. I need him to lean upon. I can't even visit with him as a wife with a husband. And maybe Abraham was saying, as they were paying him, giving him goods, giving him riches, giving him cattle, giving him flocks, I don't want these things. I really want my wife, but how can I get her back? See, they shouldn't have been down in Egypt. If you're in a place where you have to be afraid of the world, you're in the wrong place. If you have to be afraid of the face of man, you're in the wrong place. God had to teach them a lesson. And so the way that God took care of the situation was, it would seem, not punish Abraham, not punish Sarah, but make other people suffer for the mistake of these two. Do you know that happens often? God took care of Abraham and Sarah so that she never did become the wife of the Pharaoh. Verse 17, I want you just to underline with your pen, the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house. Not Abraham and Sarah. He didn't send sickness upon them. He didn't send trouble upon them. It looked as though they were multiplying in riches. And yet I'm sure they were totally unhappy. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh. And then God spoke to him and told him the reason for the plagues. I want you to color me with green at the end of verse 17. Was because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Isn't it interesting? It's because of the wife. The wife should not have agreed with her husband to do this thing, to allow it to come to pass. Now, of course, we don't know all the things that might have happened in the conversation previous to this. Maybe she begged her husband not to do it. We don't really know. But the plague became a plague upon the household of Pharaoh because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And then Pharaoh comes to Abram, notice. He did not go to Sarah. He went to the head of the house. That's why I say the head of the house was ultimately responsible. And he said, why did you, this is the next verse, why did you not tell me she was your wife? Just color in, your wife. You see, he didn't say, why did you tell me, that she's your sister, but why didn't you tell me she was your wife? And then Abraham has to conjure up all these excuses, about how I thought my life would be in danger and so forth. And I was afraid that you would take her away from me and that you would kill me for my wife and so forth. We don't have time to go into all the details, but over and over again in verses 19 and 20, she is referred to as Abram's wife. Pharaoh says to him, Abram, you take your wife. See that near the end of verse 19? You take her and go. Go away. I don't want you here in Egypt. And then Pharaoh commanded his men not to bring any harm on either Abram or Sarah, but to see that they were sent away. By the way, that always makes me ask this question. Have you ever been rebuked as a Christian by the world because you compromised your testimony? There is nothing more humbling. See, the Christian ought to be walking close to God. And the Christian would like to be chastised by God in private. Not anybody else know about it. But can you imagine a man of the world rebuking one of God's servants and say, you ought not to have done that thing. It was unethical. It was not pleasing to the Lord. How humiliating. All right, now if you had been in Abraham's and Sarah's shoes, if you don't know the rest of the story, I'm sure you do though, you probably would say, boy, I'll never do that again. And isn't it true that oftentimes when we've passed through an experience and we've experienced God's grace, neither Abram nor Sarah were hurt in any way. In fact, they came away the wealthier for it, they thought. Now Sarah had a maiden, a handmaiden. Now Abram had all these riches, so it says he was very rich. And his nephew also was very rich. We'll be talking about him next week, along with his wife and daughters. You would say, well, we got God's blessing in spite of it. And maybe we treat that testing a little too lightly. And we think the world was the one that was judged. And perhaps it never really hits us, God meant business. Well, I don't want to run ahead of my story here, but you notice that they did go back. They took a lot with them. Now I want you to move over with me to chapter 16, because we're going to take up that next point where after they've returned, and the handmaiden went with them. I'm just going to touch upon this very briefly because we went into great detail on this last week. We don't need to go into it again today. Abram's wife, notice that again in chapter 16, verse 1, colored in with green. Abram's wife bore him no children. See, he'd been down in Egypt now. He'd come back home. She still was childless. And as a result, she asked him to take Hagar. We studied her in great detail last week. And to have a child by her, and that would carry on the family name. And he agreed to do it. You see, they were rather a compromising couple. And first Abram gets his wife in trouble, and then she gets him in trouble. All right, now you move on. We won't discuss that because we discussed it all last week. And you'll notice in chapter 17 that God appeared to Abram when he was 99 years of age. And that would make Sarah, who was 10 years younger than he, 89 years of age. And he says to Abram, your wife is going to have a child in due season. That would mean 9 months from now. All right, you go down to verse 15 of chapter 17 and color in. As a result of God's vision to Abram at this time, when Sarah is to become a mother of a newborn child at that ripe age, her name is changed from S-A-R-I. See, Sarah, your wife, color that in with green in verse 15. He says, you shall not call her name Sarah anymore. It's probably called Sarai, if you have the pronunciation there. Color in with green. But her name shall be Sarah. See, with an H in the end of it. Now that name, Sarah, means, and you'll want to jot this in the margin, princess. Princess. When you and I get into right relationship with God, we read in the book of Revelation that God has a new name for us. Now, maybe your parents gave you a name and you've never been happy with it. Maybe some of you have been happy. We've always wondered if children should, rename themselves when they grow up because they always think that they'd rather have a different spelling for their name or whatever. And yet, we were all, named by our parents. And Sarai's mother had named her Sarai, and now God says change her name to Sarah because she is to be a princess. She was to be the mother of a whole new group of people, the Israelites. Now, she didn't realize all that was implied in this, but the reason I would like to stress the change of her name is when you and I accept Jesus Christ as our Savior and let Him cleanse our hearts and make us new creatures in Him, we immediately become the children of the King. And you are a princess, I am a princess. We are of royal blood. That gives us a greater responsibility than we ever had before, to live up to that royal name. Book of Revelation says when we get to heaven, we're going to know the new name that God has for us. Aren't you looking forward to that day when you see just what God is going to give you by way of a name? It's special to Him, unique because you're created by the hand of God. There are no two women in this room that look alike, at least in my eyes. And in God's eyes, you're an individual. And you're very special in a different sort of way, just like when you have children in your family. Each one is an individual. You can't put them all in the same mold. There are no two of them that are exactly alike. Or she's a princess. You and I are princes also. All right, now, look, end of verse 17. We finally got to it. We've come to the story where Abraham is informed that he's going to have a child. And Sarah, when she hears it, says, or rather Abraham says about it, shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear? Now, will you just color in 90 years old? Abraham just cannot believe God. And at this point, he really wants to have Ishmael as the one to carry on the family name. He begs God for that. There are a lot of Christians that are willing to accept second best. And God says, I've got something just a little bit better for you. And He says, let Ishmael live before you. He's grown to love Ishmael. And then verse 19, God rebukes him and he says, Sarah, your wife. Color that in with green. See? He never recognized Hagar as Abram's wife. He says, Sarah, your wife, underline, shall bear you a son indeed. And then he tells him what the name of that boy is. He will be called Isaac. And you might want to jot down in the margin what Isaac means. Laughter. Now, ladies, let me ask you a question. If you knew a couple who had been longing for children and longing for children, wouldn't it bring a lot of joy into their hearts if, finally, after several years of marriage, God finally gave them a child? What happiness it would bring into that home. And now I'd like you to go over to 18 and verse 9, because God reconfirms that message by sending some messengers to Abram's tent. And one of the questions that the men ask is this in verse 9, where is Sarah, your wife? Isn't that interesting? Once again, your wife. Always, over and over again, it's always referred to in this way. Now, the thing I like about this is, and the reason I'm bringing it out is, Abraham knew just where his wife was, what she was doing. And I think it's very important for a husband and wife to keep open communication at all times so that they know what the other person is doing, where they are. In another instance that we're going to study of another woman, the husband didn't know where his wife was. But in Abraham's situation, he knew that his wife was in the tent. And he says, see, she's in the tent. And this is when the angels say loud enough for her to hear, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. That would be the 9 months. And lo, Sarah, color it in again, your wife shall have a son. Now you all know what Sarah did. She laughed. Now if you were 90 years old, God allowed you to live to be 90, and you had never borne children, you have to realize that you would really not expect to have a baby at 90 years of age, any more than I would. And so I can hardly blame Sarah for laughing. But you know, Abraham had kind of laughed inwardly too. And sometimes we kind of blame Sarah for laughing out loud. But you know, sometimes women don't have that, they can't keep it to themselves, and they spontaneously exhibit their feelings. And she laughed, but after all, the child's name is going to be called Laughter too. He's going to bring a lot of happiness to their home. Now, maybe Sarah laughed because she was happy, but I think probably there was a little unbelief too. And it says in verse 11, Sarah and Abraham were old and far gone. In other words, you just never would expect that an aged couple like this would suddenly be blessed with a little son. And you notice in verse 12 it says Sarah laughed within herself, and she says, I'm past the age. Am I going to have this pleasure? And then in verse 13, the Lord spoke to Abraham, the head of the house, and he said, why is Sarah laughing? I'm putting that in our modern English. Why is your wife laughing? What's so funny about God being able to do this? You know what I'd like to introduce here? Is there anything too hard for God? Now, if God could give parents that are 90 years of age and 99 years of age a little son, is there anything that's impossible with God? Our prophets in the Old Testament asked that same question. Is there anything too hard for God? Maybe you're limiting God. I think one of the books maybe in my library here is Limiting God. I'm not sure if I brought it, by Hunter, Mr. Hunter. But anyway, lots of us Christians limit God. We think God needs our help, or we think we have all the answers, and if we can't figure a way out, God can't. And some writer has written, your God is too small. Lots of Christians have a very small God. Now, I don't know how big your God is to you today, but we have a great God. He created the world. He created you, and the psalmist said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. See, in my mother's womb. And when you think of the conception of a baby, there's not a thing the mother and father do except bring conception to that baby, but the Lord gives the life, and the Lord does all the forming thereafter. It's all God. And so Sarah, typical woman, denied it. Oh no, I didn't laugh. I really didn't. And you know, God knows our hearts. He knew why Sarah laughed. And of course, God, I'm sure, excused her for it. Well, now I'd like you to move over to chapter 20, because our time is just about gone. And in chapter 20, we have the testing, which they failed the first time. God says, I'm going to let you take that exam again. Ladies, can you think right now of any time in your life where you failed God? Now, don't try to think of too many times. And don't go home and make a list because you might be too prone to worry about it. But think for a moment of one time you failed God and you wouldn't want to have that test come to you again. Now, don't think too hard because maybe God will do what he did to Sarah and Abram. He might allow that test to come. Chapter 20 tells us another famine comes to the land. Abraham, your wife is pregnant. You're going to have a little baby. It's much harder once you fail a test to pass it the second time. You better pray for victory the first time because the second time it's even harder. Now my wife is expecting I've got to take extra good care of her. I've got to get out of God's will though to do it. I can't stay here in the promised land. There's nothing to feed all my flocks. I can't support my wife. I've got to get out into the world to help God out. Oh, but Abraham, didn't you learn your lesson the first time? Because you know what Abraham did? I'm just boiling it all down for you. He says to his wife, you just tell him you're my sister. Now this time he didn't go down to Egypt. He went to Gerar. He went to a different place. He didn't have the nerve to go down to Egypt and do it all over again. So he went to a different place. And you know, changing your locality will not change you. You drag the same old you right along with you. Just because I left Burlington 4 months doesn't mean that I left all those things that shouldn't be in my nature back there in Burlington. I brought them right along with me up here, sad to say, to Pepperell. I'm the same person. I hope, by the grace of God, each day is a little closer to Him and a little stronger in Him. But any of the hang-ups I had back there that I didn't have victory over, brought along with me. And Abraham and Sarah took the same hang-ups with them down to Gerar. And even though his wife was bearing that precious seed at that ripe old age, and they both knew it, he said, just tell me my sister. Otherwise they'll kill me. I don't trust God to take care of me. Sometimes we say that. And so I'd like you to notice, color in, verse 2, Sarah, his wife, and this is what she's to say, is my sister. Now Abimelech was the king of Gerar. When he found this out, of course remember she was a rejuvenated woman. She was bearing a child, and if there's anything more beautiful than a woman who's expecting a child, especially that first child, I don't know of it, except maybe when she's a bride, but she's so happy and thrilled to think she's having a baby. And now, this woman in conception, this woman who's already conceived, is taken into the harem of Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and is separated once again. And when a woman is expecting a child, there is no time when she needs her husband more than at that time, and they need to be really close together. Woman's moods up and down during that time. You're all women, so you'll understand what I mean. And the same thing happens. Same problem arises. And God deals with Abimelech. See, he can't touch Abraham because he's out of his will. He doesn't speak to Abraham because Abraham is out of his will. So he goes to Abimelech. And he tells Abimelech that Abraham has told him a little lie. Big lie. It's a half-truth. You know, deception is worse sometimes than an outward lie. You like to believe a person. You like to trust them. And God spoke to Abimelech in verse 7, and he said, restore, who? His sister to the man? No, his wife. color in his wife with green. That's chapter 20, verse 7. Restore this man's wife to him. Why? He's a prophet. He's a special child of mine. Oh, ladies, can you ever think what that must have done to Abram's testimony at that time? Verse 9, we read that Abimelech called Abraham and he says, "What have you done to us?" Now color that in, that question. What have you done to us? Why did you do this? And then he says to him, he rebukes him. He says, "You ought not to have done these things. What you have done ought not to have been done." Isn't it awful, ladies, when the world recognizes God's will better than the Christian does? What a tragedy when the world has to rebuke the Christian. And then Abraham, a little bit of a coward in him, verse 11, he says, well, I thought, talk about excuses, don't we like to excuse our sin? He says, I was sure the fear of God was not in this place, and you'd kill me for my wife's sake. Shame on Abraham. I am sure Abimelech probably felt like saying to him, is that how great your God is? See, the fear of God is not in this place, so I was afraid you'd kill me. And then he goes to Sarah, and look, the last time, the Pharaoh of Egypt did not go to Sarah, but Abimelech went to Sarah, and he said to her, at the end of verse 13, this is your kindness which you show to me. At every place which you shall go, say of me, he is my brother. Now go down, and end of verse 14, color in. He restored Sarah his wife to him. And then in verse 16, he says to Sarah, and color in to Sarah with green. Notice, I have given your husband, no, I have given your brother. See, he picks her right up on the lie that she told. I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Now he did this to get them out of the land, to get them off his neck. And then he says to her, look at the rebuke he gave to her. He is a covering to you before the eyes of all that are with you and all others. Now color in at the very end of the verse. So she was reproved. This is why I believe, on the basis of what is written here, ladies, that when your husbands ask you to compromise, you really ought to sit down and talk it over with them and say, I can't. It's going to hinder my Christian testimony. I look at Sarah and I say, God did not approve of what she did. He allowed her, as well as her husband, to be rebuked by an unbeliever. And I would dare say that not one of us in this room today want to be rebuked by an unbeliever, right? So let's walk close enough to God so that we will not have to be rebuked. Now, chapter 21 goes along to tell about how God visited Sarah just as he had promised. He fulfilled the promise. We realize when they got back to the promised land that God took care of them. He provided for them. Everything was done for them that God said would be done for them. Isaac grew up, and I'm just going over this very quickly because we're not talking about Isaac, but he became a young man. Abraham took him off to offer him to God as a living sacrifice if God so required it. But let's talk about Sarah. One final thought that's given about her in chapter 23, verse 1. I did not have to put a major point here, but I want you just to see that something very unusual. Sarah is the only one who is recorded in Scripture with an account of her death and burial. Isn't that interesting? But she was the mother of this new seed that was very precious to God, the children of Isaac. I want you to color in verse 1 of chapter 23, Sarah was 127 years old. And in verse 2, and she died. Now when Sarah died, this is why I say there must have been times in her life when she was very lonely. She was all alone. They had to send a message to Abraham to tell him that his wife had died. She died a lonely woman, as well as many times during her life lived a lonely life. And perhaps some of you struggle with the feeling of loneliness at times. I trust that it will help you just to be drawn closer to the Lord, and that he will become the friend that you need, the guide that you need at all times. The thing that I like about this chapter, can't go into detail, is that when Abraham gave her a burial, it was a royal burial.